Good morning, Year 4, and welcome to your first lesson of Spring Term 2. We hope you had a lovely half term, had a good rest, and are ready for some fantastic learning. So here we are in our reading lesson, where as normal on a Monday, we know what we're doing. We're looking for new vocabulary. So to explore vocabulary is our learning intention today. And to be successful, we will make sure we can identify words that we don't know. We will make sure we work out the meaning using all the reading strategies we've been learning, and we'll check the meaning using a dictionary. Okay, so for your starter, can you think back to all that reading we did in term 1 and explain why Holly was upset at the end of chapter 11? So chapter 11 was the chapter we read last, just before half term. And can you remember we were introduced to that new character, that girl cat called Holly? Can you remember why she was upset and who upset her? And just stop the video and write it down. Can you also do some predicting now? So thinking about what will happen. So Varjak found himself alone again at the end of chapter 11. Can you predict what you think he will do and what will happen to him in this chapter? So where do you think he will go? Will he meet any other cats? What will happen? Think about what you know about the story so far, what's been happening, the patterns, and write something down. Okay, pause the video and write it down. Okay, so that's got our brain warmed up, has reminded us a little bit of Varjak Paw, and now we're going to move on to doing some reading and noting down the words. So we are really good at this now because we do it every Monday. So we write down the words we haven't heard, what I think they mean, and then eventually we find out the actual meaning by looking it up in a dictionary or an online dictionary. I want us to really think. I've put some nice key questions here. Why it is important to understand the words in the book. Have a little think. Does it matter if you can't understand all the words? Does it affect your understanding of the story? How does knowing the words enhance your understanding of the story? Okay, so have a little discussion with yourself or with anyone else that's around. Why is it important that we really learn new vocabulary, and how does it help us understand a story better? Okay, so let's sit back and do some reading together, or you can just listen. Okay, so I'm really excited to find out what happens next, and I hope you are too. Chapter 12. Just to let you know as well, before I start, we will be doing 2 chapters at a time now, so that we're able to get through the book, because we are meant to be finishing this book by the end of this term. Okay. Varjak walked in the other direction. He shivered as he walked. The grass felt wet and clammy cold beneath his paws. The sky was clear after the storm, but it looked hollow and black, as though the rain had washed even the moon and stars away. It was much worse being alone now that he had a moment with Holly and Tam. It made him realise how alone he'd been before and how lonely he was again now. Still, he had to get on with his mission, find a dog, take it home, beat the gentleman and his cats. The city loomed up ahead. From the hill he'd seen it all and how it fitted together. But on ground level, he couldn't see further than the nearest building. Even the smallest of them blocked his way. Their thick brick walls reared up before him, higher than the Contessa's house. The night was full of strange sounds too. Things were rumbling, bells ringing, sirens wailing. What did it all mean? How was he going to find his way through it? He badly needed help. Holly and Tam, so there's our answer to our starter. I'm just going to pause here because we didn't talk about that. Do you remember who Tam was? So Tam, if you remember, was a friend of Holly's. And the thing that upset Holly was because he had mentioned another cat. Can you remember his name or her name? That's right, it was Luca. And because Tam had mentioned Luca, a cat they didn't see anymore, who used to make them laugh, and she really missed him, it made her upset. And that's why she ran off into the night and Tam followed her. Because they went, it meant that Varjak was all alone again. Okay, so that was the start. And then the prediction, obviously, you'll have many ideas and you just have to see if you were right as we carry on. Okay, so I'll read that bit again. Holly and Tam seemed to know what they were doing, but they were gone and they weren't coming back. Varjak walked through a gate at the park's edge. Beyond it was a narrow pavement and a wide black road, lined by orange street lamps. They looked like spiny iron trees with clusters of light on their branches. Instead of the sweet scent of fruit, they smelled sharp and electric, buzzing nervously above him. I just want you to take note of that lovely description of those street lamps. So when you're writing, so rather than just saying they were lined by orange street lamps, the authors used another 2 long sentences to describe them. So it just helps you think about when you're writing stories, how you can really include lots of description. He felt exposed in their glare. Further down the pavement, he could hear people, groups of them. Some were talking, others were laughing or shouting at each other. His fur prickled, remembering the men who came to the Contessa's house that night. Do you remember that back in the early chapters? He didn't want to be seen. It felt too risky out here on his own. Across the road, there was a quiet-looking alleyway between the brick houses. It looked a safer place to be. Is he going to go down there? Do you think it's going to be safe? Varjak stepped onto the pavement and froze in his tracks. Before him, lined up on the edge of the road, was a whole column of shiny metal monsters. They stood in single file, stock still. What do you think they could be? They weren't moving or making any sound. Their eyes were dull and lightless, their round black wheels at rest. But they were dogs, and this was Varjak's chance to talk to them. "Excuse me," he said. They didn't react, not even a flicker in the eyes. Perhaps they were sleeping. He took a deep breath and crept closer to them, ready to run if they suddenly awoke. He slunk onto the road, stretched out a paw, and gingerly touched a monster's smooth metal flank. It was cold, not asleep, but dead. Varjak shivered at the thought. Far away, but closing in, something shrieked, something roared. Varjak's heart thudded in his chest as he turned to face it. The shrieking, roaring noise grew louder. It was a pack of dogs, live ones, and they were coming down the road towards him. Okay, remember to be writing down your words as we're going. You may not have known gingerly or slunk, so have a think if you understand those words. Write them down if you're not sure. He'd forgotten how fast and wild they were. In motion, they blurred beneath the streetlights. Their yellow eyes were open, so round and bright that they seemed to pierce his skull. He couldn't meet their gaze. He had to look away. No wonder people were scared of them. Varjak quaked as the monsters roared past, one after another, after another. They were massive, mighty, unstoppable. In their wake came that foul, choking smell. It made him cough and cough and cough. He cowered in the lethal wind, watched the red eyes at the back recede into the distance. "What should I do, Jalal?" Awareness, the second skill. Okay, I'm just going to underline this because that's a really important part of the book, isn't it? We've had a first skill, and now we've got a second skill. So I'm just going to highlight that. Before you do anything, you must know what you are dealing with. Assume nothing. Be sure of the facts. All right, the fact was these dogs wouldn't notice him if he just sat there and called out to them. They wouldn't even hear him. He had to make one of them stop. That came first. There was only one way to do it, and Varjak's stomach tightened as he realised what it meant. He was going to have to stand in front of them, in the middle of the road, as they sped towards him. Then they'd see him and would have no choice but to stop. It would take courage, but he could do it. He could do it. He was sure he could. Deep inside him, something shrugged its shoulders and walked away. "Absolutely not," it said. "I'm not Jalal. I'm not even Julius. The dogs are never going to stop for me. Even if they see me, they'll just run me over. They'll kill me. Look at them. They're huge, heartless monsters. They don't slow down for anything. It's pointless even to try." But he had to try. The elder Paul gave his life so he could try. Him and no one else. That sacrifice would mean nothing unless Varjak was prepared to risk his own life too. And hadn't he always wanted a chance to prove himself a proper Mesopotamian blue? Varjak closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and strode out into the road to the very centre of the dog's path. Another pair of yellow eyes appeared in the distance. He could smell the foul breath from here. He could hear the deafening roar. The tales were right. These monsters filled his heart with fear. It clawed at his insides as they came towards him. "Stop!" he called. The eyes were big and dazzling. Varjak looked straight into them. He ignored the piercing pain they made in his head. He ignored his muscles screaming at him to run from this oncoming beast. He stood his ground. He remembered the elder paw in the garden, facing up to the gentleman's black cats. So brave, that was what he needed now. "Please stop," he shouted. "I have to talk to you." The eyes grew bigger and bigger. The monster was coming closer and closer, and behind it he could see others of its kind, a whole pack of them. Good, he was smack in front of them. They couldn't get past without going through him. Jalal could do this. I can do it too. The monsters kept coming, and still he stood his ground, though he had to dig claws into tarmac to stop himself running. "I need your help," he yelled. "Please, please, please." But the monsters weren't slowing. They were speeding. They were shrieking, roaring, bearing down on him. Huge, deadly. Stand your ground. Stand your... Brrrr! Fur, fluttered, fur, flattened. Monsters roared over his head, to his left, to his right, to his left, and were gone. Varjak stayed flat on the ground, cowering, crushing himself into the tarmac, even though the dogs were gone and all his hopes of saving the family with them. He crawled across the hard black road to the other side, still not daring to stand up straight. His body shook with shock. If he'd moved, if he'd even breathed as they passed over him, they would have destroyed him. He'd come within a whisker of death. He knew that. But that wasn't the worst of it. The worst of it was that he'd failed. Oh, poor Varjak. Right, reflect on how many words that you have found and not known in this chapter, and then we'll read the next chapter in just a second. And just have a little think again about why the author has chosen to use such short sentences. What kind of effect does that have? Okay, so you've done some words, and let's move on to chapter 13. I think there are more words to find in this one than the next one, just to let you know. So chapter 13. Varjak's head hung low. How's he feeling? Why is he feeling like that? What image is that head hanging low giving you of how he's feeling? He could hear more monsters in the distance coming closer. He couldn't face looking at them. What was the point? He knew now that they'd never stop and help him, not in a million years. He'd failed to do the one and only thing he'd ever been trusted with. What good was he to anyone? Julius was right. He was no Mesopotamian blue, and never would be. He was an insect, worse than an insect. He was a disgrace to the name of Jalal. He'd failed. Varjak glanced up at the hill far away on the other side of the park. There was no way he could go back there, not without a dog. That meant he might never see his home again. The kitchen full of china bowls, the Contessa's red velvet armchair, even the new toy mouse. Never again. It was empty except for a swarm of black plastic rubbish bags, so full that they'd split open. Ruined food seeped out of the bags like blood from a wound. The ground was slippery with scraps, soggy bread, slimy fruit, discarded and decaying in the dirt. Now, I hope you noticed something then, that this bit didn't really make sense. And I wanted us to think about the fact that when we miss out a word or don't understand a word, we can actually get the meaning of the story. But when we miss out a whole section, it doesn't make sense. And I hope you noticed that, because did you know what we were talking about when I said it was empty? What was empty? Okay, and I'll go back and I've added it in. So here before we stopped here, we were talking about the house, but he wasn't talking about that being empty. So I'll read this bit to you now. He slunk into an alley that led away from the monsters, away from the hill, away from the memories of home. This alley was narrow and dark with the shadows of the night. Now it makes sense. It was empty, so the alley was empty, except for the swarm of black plastic rubbish bags that were split with food seeping out. Okay, and the ground was slippery. Somewhere in the distance, almost buried by these smells, was the tang of meat. Varjak's stomach grumbled. It had been so long since he'd eaten. He remembered insisting to mother and father that he wanted to hunt like Jalal. He laughed bitterly at the memory. It was easy to talk about hunting, but to actually do it, him, the coward who couldn't even stop a dog. Farjak, who disgraced his whole family, a hunter like his famous ancestor. No, an old scrap of meat was all he was good for, all he could get. Farjak followed the scent. His awareness led him along the alley and over a wall. He came down into the most desolate place he'd seen. It was an enclosed courtyard. The sky was hidden here. He'd lost the moon and stars. He could see nothing but big concrete tower blocks looming all around. Every door and window was shut, as if the people inside were trying to keep something out. This place made him nervous. The blocks would be impossible to climb. Their walls were smooth and sheer. If something went wrong, if there was trouble, he could easily be trapped. The only way out was the way he'd come in. Still, at least it was shadowy. There were plenty of places to hide, and it was quiet. All he could hear was the muffled rumbling of the city in the distance. The smell of meat was potent in this barren place. With grim precision, Farjak tracked it to a metal bin that clanked in the corner, helpless on its side in a murky pool of rain. Something brushed against his shoulder. Farjak gasped, ducked, swung around. What was it? No one there, just a rustling sound. A plastic bag caught by the wind was circling him as if it was the hunter and he was the prey. He let out his breath, told himself not to be so nervous, and turned back to the bin. The smell of meat wasn't quite so nice close up. It was rancid, rotten. That was why he'd picked it up from so far away, his nose wrinkled. This wasn't how he'd imagined life outside. If only he could have a bowl of the gentleman's caviar now, but this was all he deserved. Farjak moved towards the bin, and the world erupted into violence. Out of the shadows, those perfect hiding places, 5 fully grown tomcats sprang. Not one of them wore a collar. Farjak put up his paws to defend himself. They were too fast. In a vicious blur of speed, they slammed him to the ground and pinned him there. The biggest, a massive, muscly ginger tom, towered over him. It ripped his cheek with claws as sharp and white as lightning. Farjak howled with pain. "These are our bins, Sonny," yelled the ginger, "and don't forget it." Farjak wrenched a paw free and lashed back. He caught the ginger full in the face. It didn't budge, didn't even flinch. It just opened its jaws and spat at him. The other cats poured down on him, a deadly rain of claws and teeth. Farjak screamed. It was agony. "What do you do about the vanishings?" demanded the ginger. It was as big as the gentleman's cats. "What vanishings?" gasped Farjak. "Don't pretend." Claws raked across Farjak's side. Bony paws pummeled his head. He clenched his eyes tight and curled into a ball. Off in the distance, he could hear a siren wailing. This was it. This was the end. He was going to die alone in this lifeless concrete place, and no one would ever know. A sense of relief washed through him. He was glad it was over. He didn't want to live anymore. He didn't deserve to live, not after he'd let everyone down. Already it seemed very far away, like it was happening to someone else. His body felt cold and weightless, as if from a great height, through a curtain of pain, he could hear voices talking. He wondered vaguely whose they were. "Leave him alone, Ginger," a gravelly voice. "Well, look who it is. Friend of yours, is he, Holly?" Ah, thank goodness Holly has come to the rescue, because Farjak was feeling very low there, wasn't he? And he was saying some really worrying things. And I was worrying about you reading that, to be honest. So thank goodness we've got a positive thought here, and a good friend has come along to save him. And hopefully she will inspire him with some confidence, and he won't have these horrible down thoughts anymore, because that was not nice reading, was it? So I'm really pleased that we've ended on a happy note of Holly coming. So did you find any more words that you didn't know? Have you written them in your column? Remember to work out what they mean. You use your strategies. That was part of your steps to success, or sorry, your success criteria. So think about what is happening in the sentence or the passage. Find the surrounding words that help you explain the meaning of the unknown word. Think about the similar words or root words you already know within that word. And as always, when you think you figured it out, put it into a sentence. So substitute the words in and make sure the sentence makes sense. Okay, that's the best thing to do to see if you think you know what the word is. Let's find a word and see if we can work out what it might mean. Right at the beginning, there was a word called gingerly. Tell me if you see it on this page. Aha, there we go. He slunk onto the road, stretched out a paw, and gingerly touched a monster's smooth metal flank. So let's think of our skills. Let's substitute some words it could be. So how can you touch something? So you can touch something quickly. You can touch it heavily, slowly, carefully. Okay, so put all those words in a sentence and what would make sense? So he slunk onto the road, stretched out a paw, and quickly touched a monster's smooth metal flank. Would he touch it quickly if he's scared? Or would he touch it carefully? So he slunk onto the road, stretched out a paw, and carefully touched a monster's smooth metal flank. Which one of those do you think is more likely? Quickly, lightly maybe? Would he touch it lightly or heavily? Have a pause and have a think. What do you think gingerly might mean? Okay, so I'll tell you now that it means in a careful or cautious manner. So hopefully that sentence helped you to work that out. And also the way he was already feeling at that time, being a little bit worried about what he's found. Okay, so do the same with all the other words you found. If you weren't quite sure what words to use, then as always, I've done a support one where I've put words in there for you. And they are the words here, and you can find those on Teams. Okay, so go to Teams, fill out your vocabulary grid, put your sentences in, put your words you found out into some sentences, and send that through to me to have a look at. Okay, right. Have a fantastic time completing your reading, and we'll see you for some more reading questions tomorrow, where we'll be looking at the skill of retrieval.